Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and this is the EarthWorks podcast. And I am so excited today because I have a friend of many years ago with me, and somebody I want to introduce to you folks who many of you may not know, but you probably know his work. And we're going to talk about it. We're here with Mr. Fred Walters, who is the former publisher of Acres USA, who is the publishing house for sustainable agriculture. And those of you who have been watching us on the YouTube channel, those books over my right shoulder all these days are all Acres USA publications. And I think, quite honestly, Fred, most of the books in my library are probably from Acres USA. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're no longer with the magazine. You have, are you, maybe I'm wrong, are you at all associated with them? Are you doing anything for them? You are doing something.
We're good friends. A great team has taken it over. The magazine's now in its 51st year. Wow. Never having missed a monthly edition, which is amazing for any publication, much less a small business started in a basement. Yeah. So, and they're doing a fabulous job, great team. And so it's great for our family that the legacy is living on. I grew up in the business. I ran it for 25 years, but worked in the business for half of the remaining years. So
you must have been a kid when you got into this thing.
A lot of pages of copy have flown, but amazing stories and amazing people.
For those of you who don't know Acres USA, I'm going to encourage you to go to their website at acresusa.com. If for no other reason, their book review or their book list is incredible, including many of the books that we cut our teeth on. Jerry Brunetti's book, of course, is there, the one behind me, as well as a couple books by Bill McKibben. I don't know if you know all this, but Fred, you of course knew Jerry very well. But when I first started with Jerry, he gave me two books. One was your dad's book, The Primer, and the other book was Neil Kinsey's book, Hands-on Agronomy, which I ended up taking with me to Rutgers when I spent some time there. But those two books were the first things that he gave me when I was a young punk county extension agent, or a kid out of college, having been trained conventionally. And here's this guy who I didn't know much about, but he gives me these two books, and I'm like, what is this hocus pocus, And then I started reading through it, and I'm like, wow, this is brilliant. I mean, this is really quite refreshing to be able to see, especially what your dad did. And for those of you who don't know, Fred's dad was Charles Walters, we call Chuck. And Chuck Walters is an iconic image in sustainable agriculture. And I had the great pleasure of getting to know him. In fact, I don't know if you know this story, Fred, but I spoke for one of your meetings. I want to say it was, I don't know how long, 20 some years ago. And I had just started teaching at Rutgers, and Chuck introduced me to the speaking engagement that I was going to be the presenter at, and said I was the first guy that he knew of that ever taught the Albrecht method at a university, which I was quite proud of. I didn't know that at the time. I assumed this was just common knowledge. Of course, I was ultimately fired from that same job for teaching the Albrecht method at a major university, but I still am in communication with a lot of guys that went through our class, and we've had a lot of them on our podcast that have talked to us about, how that has influenced them. Did you know Dr. Albrecht? Did you ever meet him?
I actually did. I was a teenage kid, and Dad drug us down to the University of Missouri. And remember Dr. Albrecht, he kept an office there, even though he was emeritus and retired and quite elderly at that time. And he gave me a chemistry book and said, read that. There's knowledge in that book. And it was an ancient, old, dusty book from his shelves. Of course, being a teenager, I think I was trying to figure out how to make gunpowder or something. But he took us evil around to Sanborn Field, and he took us some of the greenhouses, and we had lunch with him. And
oh, how cool!
And so I've actually met him a few times, and there's some old photos that I won't share because of the terrible hairdo I had at the time.
Oh, please share, please.
I did meet the gentleman.
That must have been exciting. No, I can't imagine. I mean, he's one of the guys on my list of, if I could meet alive or dead, would have a chance to sit down with. I mean, he's been such an influence on a lot of our lives. You had the great pleasure. You probably knew Jerry Brunetti before I did. And of course, those that are listening know Jerry was the co-founder here at EarthWorks and my mentor and friend. But you probably met Jerry when? I don't even know. How long ago did you meet him? Do you remember?
Early 90s,
Yeah.
although he had been associated with our magazine prior to that. So
yeah,
our paths are parallel for many years.
Jerry was one of the stars of the Acres circuit. And I remember I told you the story the other day when we talked. I'd go to the Acres conference and there would be just this crowd of people hovering around, our friend Jerry. And he would just have this amazing attraction to people because he was able to give such a passionate explanation as to what it was he was talking about. And you guys, you obviously helped that a lot in a lot of ways, but you've got many a story of Mr. Brunetti, don't you? We've had many times together.
He really, my father started this magazine in the early 70s. And he said he kept hearing word from all over the world. People say, you need to go visit Dr. Albrecht. And so he tracked him down and found out he was still alive, still keeping office hours just down the road a couple of hours. And so my dad started making the trek every week and had all day sessions and really learned soil chemistry. And so their relationship really guided the early formative years and the foundation of the magazine. I had a similar, I feel like Jerry Brunetti is my Dr. Albrecht because I met him. I had worked in the business, had left the business, gone to grad school, came back and met Jerry at a holistic veterinarians conference, and just in the hallway hearing this guy that I thought was brilliant. And it turned out he knew my father. He had subscribed to our magazine and kind of hung around with him, latched onto him in a needy way all weekend, but got to know him some.
We all did that at some point, Fred.
I just saw brilliance there. And so if I take credit for any real skill, it isn't what I knew, but I could recognize people that knew things. Yeah. And so I just saw Jerry personally as brilliant and brought him into our conference. And then he went from being one talk in a workshop to one talk in two workshops to the poor guy couldn't go to the restroom without a crowd following him. Yeah. But he just knew too much. And there were several of those kind of Jerry Brunetti characters that really formed the core group of knowledge. But Jerry uniquely united as he called it, the dynamics of nature. He saw that the cell tissue in a plant was similar to the cross section of the rumen in a cow. He connected dots that a few other people did. The Phil Callahans, the Gary Zimmers, the Neil Kinseys of the world. And there's a lot of great practitioners and teachers and farmers that we've been blessed to know. But there's these very few that just they not only knew a lot, but they were able to effectively teach it and communicate it. And that was what made the difference. And Jerry just had the sponge of a mind that remembered everything he read, and he read all the time, everything all broadly, and just made him a unique talent that we were fortunate to know. And he really helped shape the business and our magazine. And when he would be at a conference or he'd be on the phone talking to someone, he would call me and say, you need to know this guy, or you need to. And so I some of the best speakers that graced our stage or articles that came across the pages of our magazine, Jerry was somehow connected to too. So our radar was similarly tuned.
Yeah, he was really in tune to all that stuff, and you're right. He's vivacious in his reading habits, and it was always very annoying for me because I worked with him, day in and day out for 30 years, and every day he would come in with some new information. I'm like, does it ever end? I mean, it's just where does it end? It's a constant flow. What
can happen when you're curious and don't own a television.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's funny, in his passing, I was always wanting to run back and just get into that library, and it's unfortunately been broken up a little bit, but he had a massive library, and I think probably 60% of the books were from Acres, but he found books from all over the world, and old publications and things that he would, that he truly loved. I mean, there are many, and I shouldn't say this out loud because I know the Brunetti family might be listening, but there are many books in my personal library that I'm sure might have come from his library at one point in time, or had been gifted me from Jerry. But let me go back a little bit and talk about your dad. Your dad was really one of the biggest voices in all time of sustainable agriculture. I mean, just an iconic, visionary in what he was doing. And I didn't realize this until I started doing a little bit of homework, but his background, your grandparents, I guess, were Dust Bowl farmers. I never knew that until just this morning, reading some history on your family. But he grew up on a small farm.
He was actually born a small farm in Ness County, Kansas, way out in western Kansas, during the Dust Bowl. Great poverty, hard times, and he told stories of life then. And his father lost the farm, and the banker came and took away his beloved horse. And my dad was a child then, but his dad looked at him and said, "Go to school, learn why they do this to people, and don't let it happen to others." And it really broke my father. He was losing the farm. He was kind of a broken man after that. Not my father, my grandfather.
Yeah.
And Dad really took it to heart. He was hardworking and dutiful. He, as a early teenager, basically sharecropped and fed his family. He's just hardworking guy. And went to college, put himself through school and grad school, and really studied ag economics. And so what was interesting, I thought, he went to Creighton, a Jesuit school, and his master's thesis was a moral basis for economics. It's not just about growth.
Really?
It's not about profit. That there has to be an underlying morality in our economic systems and economic justice. And some of these words you hear now, he was writing about 50 years ago, but he was an oddball. He was not a flaming liberal. I grew up in a house that had Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and No Nukes bumper stickers, and the John Birch Society newsletter. I mean, we had an eclectic
so
library.
You grew up a confused young man, didn't you?
And when you're 14 and start spouting this stuff that you just regurgitate from having heard at the dinner table in school, I don't know that it always serves you well. But
in Central Kansas,
interesting.
Yeah.
So
I never knew that.
So he came at it from a social justice point of view. Had a real mentor in. He worked for a rodeo magazine. He was an editor of a rodeo news for a while. A funny story there. They tagged him with the job of profiling great old cowboys. Well, the old cowboys weren't the stars they are now. They were ranch hands that drifted and itinerants. So he had to research and write life histories of people that people barely knew their name. He says sometimes he got to deadline and he had to create a history. He goes, "Don't worry, I wrote a good life story." He says, and then years later, he finds his own garbage coming back in textbook in biographies of these people about the lives he created for these old cowboys.
Oh, great. In the movies. Yeah, exactly.
But then he went to Veterinary Medicine magazine and had a great mentor there. And but really, I think where his path headed this way was a convergence. He was active with the NFO, which Jerry Brunetti was an organizer with during the late 60s, early 70s.
Farmers Organization.
National Farmers Organization, which was the closest farmers ever came to organizing and collective bargaining. And national strikes. And there were still, agriculture was still dominated by family farms at that point. And so my dad's point of view was what's good for the family farm is good for agriculture. He didn't want to see mega industrial farms and corporate farms. He wanted to see the countryside settled with families and the vibrant small towns that come from that. And we've seen what's happened as the family farm has been decimated and the towns shriveled up, and now you see what used to be inner city problems in the countryside. So I hate to say he was right, but he was right. So he his point of view with Acres USA was, how do we save the family farm? And there was a real parting of the waters then of chemical, industrial agriculture, and earth honoring, still sophisticated technology-based agriculture, but and he just said there was no future for the family farm if you go this toxic route. And at the same time, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring hit, and so he firmly held that there's just no place in our food supply for these chemicals, of these synthetic chemicals. They just shouldn't be in our food supply and in our bodies. And likewise in your business, they shouldn't be on golf balls that people are picking up and handling and then touching their mouths. It's just, and what he found in the 50-year journey that was Acres USA was, there's no reason. We have the technology, we have the knowledge. We don't need these things. The knowledge is out there. All the speakers, all the writers, all the authors, the farmers, we know how to grow anything without these cancer-causing, offensive chemicals.
And so it's kind of coming to
that was his path.
It's coming to fruition finally. I mean, he started the magazine in 1970. That must have been a hard decade, or a hard couple of decades, to be Acres USA. I mean, there was a lot of things changing at the time. Agribusiness was coming in, but and it's encouraging to see it kind of coming full circle, and we're realizing that if we do take care of the soil, things are changing. And these are all words that that you guys brought to the table. I mean, this is everything that I've learned basically has come out of the magazine and the books that you guys published. But it must have been tough those first years at Acres back in the 70s. I mean, I can't even imagine. I was a kid, as you were, but I mean, I wasn't aware of what was going on, but it had to be very frustrating at points for him.
Well, he had to really scour the countryside to find these good examples, these farmers who didn't go the Monsanto way. And they were out there, but he traveled around. And when I was in school, he gave me it was before Visa and MasterCard, gave me a Skelly credit card and hit the road. And I would drive 5,000-mile loops around the country and write stories about farmers, just profiles of people that show that this works. And he would joke that all of a sudden it's become popular, but boy, it was a long sudden.
Yeah. I mean, I know Jerry was getting into the business, and he started his company Agronomics around that time, and then or somewhere in that time frame. And then we came along in the late 80s, and it was hard even for us at the time to talk about carbon-based fertility and finding ways to help build the soil, make things better, and all those kind of things. But I can only imagine, and I've always had great admiration for what your dad accomplished. What I found interesting in some of my work on studying your dad was that he was a raw materials economist. And I was reading some things recently, and it was reminding me of conversations that I had many times with Jerry. And I'm realizing now, I know now where this was all being echoed from. I mean, he was reading your dad's work on the whole idea of how the health of an economy is based on raw materials. And obviously, with his passion and his focus on farming, that's a backbone of all this. And it was like you were mentioning earlier, it's about this moralistic concept of an economy. But I'm not even really sure what a raw materials economist is.
Personally, I feel they failed in selling the idea because of how they communicated it. By using the word raw materials, it sent the message forth that our economy is all based on grains and what we mine from the soil. And that the economists are quick to dismiss that. Well, we used to be a blank economy. Now we're a service economy.
Right.
And they took my father took the point of view, no, money, a dollar trading hands in Las Vegas is not adding wealth to our economy. And I think that a better explanation of what raw materials economics is really about is if you look at the physics of an economic system, that there are physical laws that govern our world. The chemistry, the energy, And so the physics of an economy is that where does new wealth enter an economy? Well, it's from the sun. It's energy, whether it's energy stored millions of years ago in dinosaurs and minerals under the sea, or whether it's grain coming from the ground. But the new wealth is the energy from the sun, and then everything else multiplies and adds value to that. And I wish if they would have communicated it, not using raw materials economics as the nomenclature, but calling it the physical economy, and we're adding value, and then the more technology improves and computers and skills, that increases the multiplier. So we're adding greater value and greater efficiency. But what's the fuel of the economy? And the fuel of the economy is the sun. And I think that's the core message of what they were starting. And so people like Jerry and my father, they were trying to build that into the backbone of the NFO, the Farmers Collective Bargaining message, that by having healthy family farm-based diverse economy, we will have healthy broad economies. And the history shows that to be the case, and that basically the shortages that where agriculture was shortage, we've made up in national debt. You could just watch the lines parallel each other. And so that's where he came from. But it quickly turned into a technology magazine, showing the house. We always tried to say why we farmed, or why we grew crops, or why we had pastures or golf courses without chemistry. Because in the end, we grow food to nourish human beings and children and the next generation. It's not about making a dollar in the bin. It's the purpose of why we're here is to raise people. He always used the phrase to raise people capable of thought and reason, a healthy populace. And that's why we do what we do, is to, Gabe Brown is another, rock star of ecological farming. And Gabe I remember sitting with him in a Q&A session at our conference, and somebody said, well, I'm making a lot of money. I'm farming the way Monsanto tells me. I make a lot of money. Why what you're doing with cover crops and fertility management, it seems like a lot of work. Why should I do that when I'm making plenty of money? And Gabe looked at him and says, don't you give a shit about your grandson?
I can see him doing that.
Jaw bounced off the floor. But it's true. There's got to be a bigger reason why we wake up in the morning than just making a buck.
And and Gabe's story
a little better.
Yeah, let's hope so. Gabe's story is a great one. I mean, he's the star of Kiss the Ground, the documentary, and he tells his story about how he almost lost that conventional farm, and realized that he can make it a go and significantly reduce his inputs and increase his profitability, because he was able to kind of go back to nature's words. I'm fascinated by your description of the raw materials, because I was always frustrated with that term, raw materials, because it reminds me of minerals, rocks, gold, silver, and things like that. And I always, in conversations with Jerry, I always knew this was a much more global thing. But for you to describe that from energy coming from the sun, that's what we're all about. I mean, everybody that's in the business of growing anything is all about solar energy, because that's where it all starts from. So when you describe it in that term, it makes a lot more sense to me as to what we're really talking about. Is all these benefits that we gain from the process of what we're doing with solar energy, which is kind of fascinating. But guys like Gabe Brown is a great story. I mean, he is the rock star now. I mean, he really is and he's a great guy. I remember sitting with him and Jerry and maybe Will Winter. I'm not sure who else was with us at one of the Acres conferences. We had dinner one night, and to listen to Jerry and Gabe go back and forth was one of the highlights of my life. And just
dizzy.
Oh my God. I mean, I would go to these events and just sit there and especially when it was an Acres event, because I'd have a chance to kind of literally tag along. Like you said, I am not much of an intellect, but I am smart enough to follow the people that are, and wear their coat tags, and it's created a life for me. Thank God to Mr. Brunetti. But sitting at some of those meetings, and you were at many of them, and just listening to these guys banter back and forth, and it was just fascinating. I mean, I wish I had recorded every single one of these meetings, and I'm sure you were in many, many more than I ever was, but it had to be fascinating with these characters that you were playing with.
Well, the bottom line is the knowledge it's out there and it's documented now. And in the early years, you talked about my dad's challenges. Like he is trying to find the idea, run it up the flagpole and see if anyone salutes, to find the stories. And it's almost the opposite thing now. There's just a fire hose of information out there. And I think Acres USA now is doing a great job of filtering it down to where if you read and follow Acres USA, both online, and they have a podcast and weekly emails and the monthly magazine, you will know you'll catch the high points. And it's not all about soybeans. It's so much about soil health now. And so it really applies to your field as well. But when you tell about those stories of the conference, I think that's the real value of a live gathering is it energizes you. Otherwise, you can be that lone person out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by neighbors who are laughing at you all the time. But you come to a gathering of like-minded people who are similarly curious and educated and informed, and you get inspired. It charges you up for the next year. We had a rice grower from the Sacramento Valley told a funny story once. He goes, "Oh yeah, when I come back home from an Acres conference," he goes, "I can clear out a diner fast." Starts sharing what I heard, So it's but
I can see that. No, that was
one
truly
of the more gratifying things we did. If we kept people inspired, and it is nice to hear over the years you pick up stories, and especially after my dad died, I had quite a number of people call me and say, you don't know me, your dad wouldn't even remember me, but I called him one time. I was about to lose my farm, and he actually took my call. I couldn't believe it. And he said, "You need to call so-and-so and do this." And he pointed me a couple directions, gave me a couple. He says, "I'm still here, and my son is farming the farm now." He says, he saved our life, changed our life. And, and that's where the whole thing about changing the world, one person at a time, one farm at a time, one golf course at a time, one pasture at a time,
field, one
and
school, one anything.
We're frustrated sometimes that Monsanto, that Roundup is still on the market, but on the other hand, there are so many people that have livelihoods and health, and because of messages we've helped share. And so Jerry was just such a guiding light for me personally. I know for you and your company and product line, he got it. He just connected the dots. He saw the interconnections in nature, and he saw how nature worked, and how to goose it, how to make it work. And we often have people call us and say, "Who's right? I have so-and-so saying this and so-and-so saying this." And I just often thought nature is like a big ball, and you can try to push it, you can pull it, you can nudge it. There's different ways to influence it and steer it in your direction. And Jerry is one of those oddballs that he knew all sides of that ball.
And I think you just answered that question, who's right? And the answer is nature. I mean, Jerry followed Mother Nature. I mean, he always followed, natural paths. And, we're working now closely with Lawrence Mayhew, who and Lawrence and I are kind of digging through some of Jerry's old formulas, and we're still amazed at how he came up with some of these ideas. It's like, I'm not sure what he was thinking when he did this, but it's brilliant. I don't, he's folled nature, which is kind of funny, which is so fascinating.
He both read the chemistry books, and he read the Hildegard of Bingen's herbal medicine book from 300 years ago, and he knew the phytochemistry of the herb and the mystic reliance on it for this ailment, and he just connected dots.
He was a mad scientist. I mean, he'd say, you had been in our office. He would be in the back room in the office stirring up a witch's brew and then tasting it and then like almost passing out from this. I said, "Jerry, stop eating these things. Just stop it." And I tell this story. We went to one of the very first times I went to a golf course with Jerry. And Jerry wasn't, it was not his cup of tea, unfortunately, but he was, some of the guys that we got to know were pretty interesting. And we walked into a course, and they had a big bag of kelp meal, just a bag of kelp, which is now a very popular product. But we didn't know what this was, and the golf course superintendent was saying to him, he goes, I don't know what this stuff is, but it really has this nasty odor, and he had a pretty derogatory name that I won't share on the air. But so I walk in the next week with Jerry, and I said, Jerry, what is this stuff? And he takes a handful. He goes, oh, this is kelp meal. I feed this to cows, but I get tractor trailers to feed this to cows. And he shakes the little thing in his hand, and then he eats the whole thing. And these guys turn white. Wait a second, that product that has this derogatory term, this guy just ate. So at that point, he was a hero because he could eat these things. But that's the kind of way he would live. Let me ask you this.
He could go toe to toe with a biochemistry professor in an intellectual conversation. He was. You say mad scientist, but he was a natural scientist because he really knew it was not just witchcraft. He knew the phytochemistry. He knew the cascading enzymes. He knew the hormonal interactions, and boy, it would leave you dizzy when he started explaining why you need boron down here to create this biochemical that is needed by the cow or the plant. It was amazing.
I mean, I've gone back through some of the, and you guys still keep it at Acres, some of the video clips of his talks there. And there's things even within those talks that I would still learn. I mean, I remember one he did on the mighty microbes, and then he did one on trace elements, and just fascinating depth of information that he just studied. Like you said, he read books, but the thing he was incredibly intuitive. And he always followed Mother Nature. I mean, he always let Mother Nature kind of, does this occur in nature? Is this a natural chemical reaction in nature? I mean, are we creating this falsely, or is this how Mother Nature would follow it? And it always kept him on the right road, which was fascinating. Yeah. And he, he taught us that, and we try very hard to follow it in an environment where, our environments are unfortunately not as natural, if you will, as some of the farm fields when we're talking about golf courses. But it's interesting, even in our industry, the changes that are happening now, people are understanding, and this is really, I can lead this right back to you guys and your dad, and certainly Jerry, but I would say, Jerry followed Chuck a lot, but a lot of our guys are starting to understand, it is a soil first approach. Where did Charles Walters and Acres USA start with the whole soils? I mean, it's always been a dichotomy to me. Is that Acres was a lot of cows and pigs and chickens and grain, and then there was this whole thing on Dr. Albrecht and Neil Kinsey and all these things. Was that just a natural flow? Did he make a point at some point being a soils guy?
Actually, there was very little on livestock in the first couple of decades of the magazine, and I didn't know that. I dialed that up after meeting with holistic vets and meeting Jerry, and I just saw that the diversity of farms adding livestock to their family farm mix could be profitable. And I thought that the natural approaches, they may work in the soil, they really work with living creatures.
Yeah.
And but early on, it was all about soil. And I think
I did not know that.
Happened to meet an agronomist in CJ Fenzow out in Idaho, who worked with large growers out there. And CJ talked to my dad and said, I can engineer a field based on the soil fertility to where the insects will take out 1 acre and skip over the next acre. And he knew how to work it. But like so many of these fabulous agronomists, they were limited by their day-to-day crises and firefighting and how many acres they could manage and which growers they could talk to. And then they get old, they get sick, they get tired and retire and go away. And so many of them didn't write down what they knew. So I think part of our mission was to make things a matter of record. And one of my biggest laments and regrets is not getting more of what was in Jerry Brunetti's mind and paper. There's articles and there's an unfinished manuscript on
well, we're going to talk about that because we want to finish that.
It's one of my bigger laments because that's one of the, and it is a real great value of YouTube and the digital media, but
Yeah.
there are books that around 1,000 that were printed 2,000 years ago. And so there's something about getting somebody's knowledge down on paper. It lives on and it's there for someone to rediscover. And that's where someone who can be a great conference speaker, God bless them, but only the ones in the room benefited. So that's what the new media has done so great at spreading messages so much farther than we could meet with our little conference or our subscriber base. So that's been magical.
Well, that's one of the compliments that I have to hand you very definitively, is that you were really instrumental in bringing a lot of those people to the book. Fenzo, you published him, you published obviously Jerry. I mean, I'm sure you probably pushed Gary Zimmer, and Joel Salatin, all of these guys who have great voices. Gabe Brown has published 1 or 2 books. I don't even know how many books Gabe has.
Yeah. Well, like Neil Kinsey is a great example. He was a young agronomist. My dad met him. He actually was one of Dr. Albrecht's last students who took Dr. Albrecht's soils course. And he was out practicing it. And he, to this day, he'll say he was barely making a living in his 4 counties in southern Missouri. And my dad thought he was brilliant. And the message he was sharing was pure Albrecht, just, how to manage soil fertility based on how the elements interchange on the cation. And so Dad took Neil's recordings, edited them into the book that Neil has since embellished greatly, but it's the first editions of Hands-on Agronomy were my dad's editing of Neil's talking of a 3-day soil seminar. And that book has sold tens of thousands of copies around the world, which most books, people don't know this, but most books published by even major publishers, the average sale is like 5,000 copies. Then of course there's the million sellers, there's the Harry Potters of the world, but most books don't sell that many. So for a book on soils to sell 50,000 copies around the world, well, Neil Kinsey is still in his 70s, but still trotting all over the world. He's consulting with growers around the world. And that's the power of getting the message out into broader hands, because the technique, we know how. The methods are out there. So
I was buying cases of that book from you guys for years and handing them out to guys just so they could be exposed to an idea that is a little different than conventional NP and K and pH, and it opened up a lot of people's minds. I tell this story often and on my podcast, but I ran into a former student of mine on an airplane. He's actually been on our podcast as well, but I tell the story. I think I told the story when he was on. I'm walking and I hear my name, Joel. And I look around and I look back in the plane and there's this student, and I walk down and say hi. He's holding a copy of Hands-on Agronomy. And I said, you're out of school. You don't have to suck up to me anymore. But he goes, no, I love this book. And this is a golf course superintendent that has really taken on the concepts of balancing a soil. And, there's nothing, and you said this earlier, there's nothing more gratifying than being able to help somebody, one person, 2 people, discover that there's a better way to do something. And I think this is really the legacy of what you and your family have done over the years. And I'm certainly, for one, I'm going to continue to advocate for people to study that stuff. How much do you understand?
By the way, I thank you, and my children thank you too. So,
absolutely.
We love what we do, but we didn't do it all for fun.
No, I understand that. Believe me, we're all, yes, we all have to eat. It's funny you say that, because Jerry used to always say, no, I'm going to stay in agriculture because, you always have to eat. So there's always going to be a business there some way or another. But, there's a lot of really good young guys that we've had come around that have been followers and we've met at Acres, and it's always good. Logan Labs continues to go to the show and I get to go and do some work with them and just to walk around. I mean, and I don't know many of the people anymore. I mean, since Jerry's always been gone. I've kind of, walked away from some of that. But it's all like the one thing you said was, when you go to an acre show, you truly just come back refreshed and regenerated, and just, it's just an exciting time to be there and just feel the energy. And I know that sounds a little bit esoteric, but you feel this whole energy of these people that believe it. Do you believe in your heart of hearts that this country could feed itself sustainably?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's still a massive argument. I mean, I'll still talk to, a lot of people. No, there's no way, we can never do it. I think we're starting to prove that now with the Gabe Browns of the world, and, and all those people. I mean, it's
the density of the amount of food pulled off a Joel Salatin's farm in what was a rocky, worn out soil in Virginia is, will top the most intensive farm, and it's a healthy lifestyle and healthy food, it's over and over and over. That's a straw man argument. It's we've seen it in life, in politics, the big lie. And after a while, I know people like Neil Kinsey, you just stop arguing. I know, Jerry, you stop arguing. I know Joel Salatin, who's a popular, very, very famous organic farmer. He said he said, I don't have time to try to convince people that have their mind made up. He said, I just tell them, a lot of people think that. And he says, I spend my time helping the people that are open-minded and curious. And one thing I did want to say, though, about Acres USA, and to this date, it was never an organic magazine. It was trying to change agriculture worldwide. And when you talk to the Gary Zimmers of the world, as an agricultural consultant up in Wisconsin, it's not 100% certified organic. And we always kind of felt that certification, it just tied hands behind backs. And it was sort of like, no, the chemical people should have to label their garbage, we shouldn't have to label ours as pure. And I know Dr. Albrecht really taught that there's a huge difference between a synthetic pesticide and a synthetic fertilizer. The soil life can digest, Chilean nitrate is not fine in organics, and it's a great material. It's just the acids have already worked on it. And so those synthetic man-made molecules seem to be what really mess up our hormones and cause cancers and all of that. So we looked at it as detoxifying agriculture more than making it organic, and working with nature rather than against it, always building the soil, because that's our permission to life, those few inches of topsoil, and that was our approach. And so I know people say, oh, so you have an organic farming magazine. It's like, no, that was part of it. And that's why the message that we tried to share, even though our speakers may use corn or soybeans as the example, it worked on apple orchards, it worked on pasture land, it works in turf. Neil Kinsey has many a story talk about or Malcolm Beck was a composter in San Antonio. Right. And when he started using compost on the playing fields, there were fewer injuries to the athletes because the soil was alive and resilient, rather than the kids playing on something that resembled asphalt, and so the stories are there across all crops, really.
It's funny because we still get a lot of grief. I mean, what you just said is exactly how we've been running our business for 35 years. We sell quote unquote organics, but most of our products aren't organic at all. There's very few that we actually have are able to certify organically. And I remember Jerry saying this all the time. He said, your perfect example, Chilean nitrate. Why wouldn't that be considered organic, or, at least grass, generally recognized as safe? It's certainly a good thing. But the bottom line is that really what we're trying to do, and again, I realize that this has all come from the work your dad started, but it's got to come from the soil first. We started our company with that mantra. And if we get the soil working right, in our case, we kind of stop at the grass, but in an agricultural environment, that food is now growing with more mineral density. It's going to be less likelihood to be attacked by insects and diseases, but more importantly, now that food is mineral dense. And a lot of this conventional agriculture food that we're eating, even if, you tell your kids to eat broccoli, but if the broccoli is grown on crappy soils with, just not the right kind of environment, we're not getting the minerals that we want. And that's where it's all coming from,
Well, and too, a living soil has more holding capacity and detoxifying capacity, so you don't have the toxic runoff, and that's an issue
Buffers
too,
everything.
so yeah.
One of the things you talked about, Joel Salatin, one of the things that always impressed me more than anything in his talks was when he started on that farm in Central Virginia. We do a lot of work in that area. It's the Mid-Atlantic. It's a horrible place to grow almost anything. It's very hot and humid in the summer. But his soils, and I remember him telling this story at one of your meetings. He would have guys come up over the hill and they'd look down in his valley and it was brilliant green. As if they were stealing all the water from the rivers and all this stuff. And they would all the local farmers would get kind of pissed off at him because they're assuming that he's stealing water. And he goes, no, I'm not. I'm just doing the right thing in the soils. He had his pigorators and his chicken wheels and, all the right things. And that soil was able to maintain and manage moisture, which, will become, and probably our lifetime, one of the biggest conversations ever is water management. It's already becoming an issue. I mean, as we sit here in the middle of July and on the East Coast, we're running through a drought now. I mean, it's been 20 some days since we've had any reasonable rain, and that's going to continue. But when you manage a soil like Joel would do, or these guys that have been following soil management, water retention is one of the greatest benefits in that process, which keeps the plant alive, keeps microbial activity alive, which means minerals are still moving into the plants, and the system is working better. It's just a natural progression.
Well, and the soil has always been the core of what we've been about. It's the one thing that crosses, if I tell a friend what my business was, they think, boy, that's a weird little niche. And it's like, you have no idea. Within that weird little niche, there's 100 other magazines. There's the Dairy Goat magazine and and so the one
great magazine.
The one universal thing was the soil and soil health.
Yeah.
And that, if anything, it's always been there, but we've really doubled down on it. The new team, the publishing team, has done a fabulous job to the point that they've actually got a contract from the state of Colorado to develop soil health materials. So I think
I didn't know that.
I think that kind of that's our door into mainstream agriculture, because everyone can agree on that. Everyone knows that healthy soil is good for farmers. And so I think that's a real, because boy, you start going down in our divided society, politics, ecology, global climate. Oh boy, you just instantly lost half your audience on any one of about 100 topics. So you do that, you're left with one half of one person that can agree with you. But the soil is one thing that everyone agrees on.
One of the things.
I got to tell you one quick thing.
Go ahead.
Alan Nation was a brilliant editor publisher of Stockman's Grass Farmer, which was really
Alan,
the magazine that took grass farming and the Gabe Brown sort of agriculture and made it much more mainstream and accepted in America. And Alan used a phrase. He says, "You can be he had this deep Mississippi accent. You can be a nudist or a Buddhist, but you can't be a nudist Buddhist. People will accept you if you're crazy on one thing. If you're crazy on two things, you're a nut." He goes, so he says, the one thing I'm crazy about is grass. And so I thought, the one thing we're crazy about is soil health. And so that's the one, and you can, so that, but boy, you start going off too many directions, you're crazy.
All right. I'm staying with that too. I'm staying with that.
Don't be a nudist Buddhist.
I don't want to be a nudist Buddhist, and nobody wants me to be a nudist Buddhist. Trust me. It's funny. And that goes back to that story of Jerry running into Woody Harrelson on the beach of Hawaii. And that's another story for another day.
You're going to make me cry laughing if I start.
Oh, I know. It's just, there's so many of those. And it's funny because we've been advocating one thing basically since I met Jerry, which is soil health. And it still gets an awful lot of pushback from academia. I mean, it's just, this whole concept of balancing the soil, and even the Albrecht model. I mean, a lot of our soils are man-made, they're sand-based, and we know that model doesn't work, and we don't follow the Albrecht model traditionally on a sand-based soil because there's no clay in there and there's no colloidal activity. But on a soil, I've been doing this for 35 years. I've been balancing a la Neil Kinsey, which, I went to many of his, probably 2 or 3 of his 3-day seminars, because it took me a while to get some of it through my head. And of course, read his book a dozen
times. Bill McKibben's done great work.
Bill McKibben, I was going to say, I work very closely with
balancing in sandy soils. And Neil actually has different formulas he uses for heavy clays, these extremely, high CEC soils. So, the Dr. Albrecht, one phrase that he used that my father repeated is, there's only one message. And our job at Acres USA was to find 1,000 ways to tell it. And you keep coming back to that.
I like it.
Just one message and it works. So.
Yeah. And I've made a living off of it. So I thank you for feeding me and my family, because, and I've told you the story when you got Jerry to publish that book. He asked me to read it, and I said, you can't publish this because everything I've ever said is in your book, because I've been following you for so long, and everybody will know I'm a fraud. In fact, I went back to my PowerPoint slides, and half of the pictures in my PowerPoint slides are in that book. So
since you put me on the spot to do this, I'm going to put you on the spot. And your listeners may not know that there's a half-finished, brilliant book by Joel that we wish could get into life. He did a fabulous job teaching the Albrecht method. We transcribed the multi-day seminar, and it's a manuscript in his hands. So people, pressure Joel, get it in print.
Actually, I have begun working on it once again. And as I look into the sunset, I think I will. I've promised you I will. And I have such respect for you, Fred, that I promise you that before I'm gone, if I don't get hit by a bus leaving the studio here, I will get that done. And there's, it's funny. And, you and I talked about this the other day, and you must have dealt with this for so many people like me who, have something to say after a 30-year career. But it's always, we always get tripped up over, I could say this, I could say more. And, you said something to me the other day. It's just put down on paper what you know now and make it a publication. And I have got, you gave me I will get it done, I promise.
Well, and that was one of our good friend Jerry's faults, is it was the kitchen sink. He wanted to add one more chapter. That's
what I'm doing. I just
this massive, his life knowledge on cows and pasture and soils and grass and how they all connect. And it's not published because he passed away wanting to do 2 more chapters. And so you're redoubling my resolve to see that.
Like I said, I will make you that promise before I go, but I would also love to see that animal healthcare book of Jerry's come to life if we could find a way to make that happen. Let's talk about, and I don't want to make this a morbid subject, but as Jerry was getting ill, he started his cancer battle in the early 2000s, and I'll never forget the day he got his first diagnosis, and he had some doctor telling him that he's got 6 months to live. And I was told that by, folks in the office, and I was upstairs literally in tears. And he walks in on me and he goes, "What's wrong with you?" And he goes, and I'm sitting there, what do you mean, what's wrong with you? You just got a life sentence. He goes, "I'm not going to die." And it was like, there's no question. And he lived for 20 years. But, when he started to really get through this, the 2 of you got together and you actually recorded that DVD that he put out on human health. That was going to be his 3rd book, was the one on human health. But the connection that he made full circle on, his, true life experience was, from the soil through the plant into the body. And I think you guys did a really phenomenal job of talking about that. And, and he, in that DVD you guys put together, he talked about how you avoid sugar and all that
and
stuff.
If I'm angry at Jerry about anything, he was such a scufflaw, and if they wanted to sell a license to him, he wasn't going to buy it just out of principle. It wasn't the $20,
right? And he didn't care about money.
And the refusing health insurance, even though he could afford it, just because he didn't believe in their methods. Well, that X-ray or that scan, he was chasing, when Jerry knew what to fight or what malady to fix, he fixed it. Some friend of his had seborrhea or psoriasis or something, and Jerry says, here's what you do, you put this on, do that. It's just like, it's a miracle. The man knew how nature worked. But if you think you're chasing, it's like trying to fix your car. If you think your radiator's gone bad, but you've got bad brakes, you're never going to get the repair done. And I think that with correct knowledge, Jerry'd be still with us today. And he was is brilliant, and I love him. He changed my life, but he's hard-headed too. And
yes, he was.
And I'm angry that I feel like we lost him, not because he couldn't heal himself, but because he didn't have more complete information of what he was fighting. And it's too bad. The company, I think, is pretty well, if someone publishes a video on how they cured themselves of cancer and then they die of cancer, people flush the video, and the knowledge is there. There's other factors, there's other reasons he died, and it was ultimately cancer. It was many years later, and he was chasing the wrong thing. And it's too bad that knowledge is diminished, because it's true and it works. But that's, we all have our flaws, we all have our shortcomings in life.
Well, it was he was, just to be very clear about this, he had Lyme disease, and he also had cancer, and they present themselves very similarly. One of the last things that he said to me before he passed was that, I think I was chasing I was going down the wrong road. I thought I was chasing Lyme, and it was the cancer coming back. It was an interesting story, because he and I got Lyme disease just about the same time, within weeks of each other. I was fortunate that I saw the classic bullseye, and I was able to take care of it very quickly. The antibiotics reacted well for me, not so well for Jerry. He was in a hospital room, very sick. And finally, some doctor walks by the room with a bunch of interns and said, "What's wrong with that guy?" He goes, "We don't know." And he looked at him and said, "He's got Lyme disease. Get him on this antibiotic." And he was home in 2 days. But it stuck with him for a very, very long time. And Lyme is a weird thing, like a lot of things nowadays. And he was fighting that for a long time. But that DVD that you guys put together, where you literally came to his house and recorded him on his porch and in his kitchen, I have given that to so many people that had, a father, a brother, a mother, a sister that was fighting cancer. And they were all, the little things, just the little pieces. Like the one I really remember the most was just stop eating anything that's producing sugar in the body. And he talked about that with the smoothies and the stuff that you guys put together. And that one little thing, so many people have come back to me as, man, that has made a big difference, because, and Jerry knew that cancer cells crave that energy, that sugar that they need to reproduce.
And Jerry wasn't a Luddite. He just as in agriculture,
a little bit
he wasn't he wasn't all against all synthetics. In the video, he doesn't say don't see doctors, don't do chemo, but these other things help mobilize the T cells or slow the it's like it was a very complementary approach. And I felt like his agriculture was complementary in that way. It worked even if you were 80% conventional. It worked better if you were 30% conventional, but it worked. And so, he was that way, that he when you're trying to enhance and boost nature, it works no matter what else is going on.
Yeah, it's true.
It helps.
In the last couple minutes we have here, I want to talk about that trip that you and I and Jerry and his friends, and you told me something the other day. We took a trip in, what was it, like 2006 or 8? I don't even remember what year it was now. We went to Italy, and it was back up a little. It was from an Acres USA conference.
Okay, and there was a attendee from Austria, Joel Aschel's a good friend, and I and Jerry were sitting around the corner of the lobby talking, and Jerry had taken a couple trips to Italy, and I said we should see family. We should rent a house in Tuscany, and Joe Aschel, just being a drive, next country north, had been there many times. So we thought, let's look into this. A month later, Jerry calls and says, "Oh, that trip to Italy, I told a few people and they all want to go. So the next thing you know, Joe and I are killing ourselves to organize a trip for Jerry and a dozen of his friends.
That was fun.
including
It was the greatest trip of my life. Now, the thing about that trip, though, I mean, not that, we had a whole group of pretty eclectic people, farmers from Vermont, from, Pennsylvania, Jerry's his Republican cousin, who I love.
Fertilizer, organic fertilizer maker from Australia. It was an eclectic group.
That's right. Graham was there and his wife. But we were there for a specific purpose. It was part of the slow food movement. Mm-hmm. And was that the original intent, or was that coincidental, or was that really even part of that? Or we just go there to drink and eat? I don't even know anything.
While we were there, we sought out a few slow food restaurants, and I think that's where I ate in one meal. I had truffles, horse, and first bottle of wine that cost over $100 or something like that with Jerry's crazy cousin, the wine nut. So some real firsts that.
It was a wonderful experience. I mean, just being there was another experience when, you had people like Graham from Australia and all the other folks that were with us, the lasers and just the conversation that went around that table. I mean, that one villa that we stayed in, we would just all cook something and have this huge meal and just chat. And it was really, and of course, Jerry held court for the most part. And of course, the person who, the woman who owned the villas fell in love with him, as is typical of Jerry, and followed him around as we hiked the mountains and all that stuff. But it was a wonderful experience. And, for those who don't know, I mean, the slow food movement was an attempt, certainly in Europe, because McDonald's and all the other folks were coming in. And so there was a lot of conversation at the time about, how do we keep food close to the farm, and it was a lot of conversation was had about that at those dinner tables. But I thank you for pulling that together. It was one of the highlights of my life, and I'll never forget all the people that we had and all that kind of stuff. I hate to say this, but we have extended our time. See, I told you this was going to be easy, and I knew that it would be informative, and I would love at some point to get you back in here, because I think this whole conversation on what your family's legacy is all about and what your father started is incredible, and you can tell by what I've done with my career, and I'm one of many people have really taken what your dad started and run with it. And I wouldn't be here wasn't for Acres USA and all the information I got from you and your dad and Jerry and Neil Kinsey, and like I said, I 60-70% of my library is Acres books, and it's one of those weird things. You go to the conference, and I'm not going to buy any books. I'm not going to buy any books, and you come home with a box of books. It's like I just can't not buy a bunch, 10 books, and some of them I haven't even read yet. I mean, I probably have 2 or 3 sitting here. I got all the Acres books, or excuse me, all the Albrecht books sitting here, but I've given a lot of young folks these books, and Kinsey's book and Bill McKibben's book, who we work closely with at Logan. And
imagine pre-internet, pre-Amazon.
Yeah,
it was tougher to find this information. We brought in books by the case from England, from Australia. We'd have to wait 4 months for the ship to arrive, but we would bring them in just to make them available to people. And I think that spreading of the word, you get that book in the right hands, and that person then speaks and consults and teaches. So I think it's helped this whole movement snowball. It's really gratifying to be a part of it.
And I would encourage anybody that has anything to do with growing anything is to, find you at Acres USA and just look at their books. I mean, there's going to be a lot of books you're not going to have any interest in, obviously. And there's going to be some you may not agree with, but there's going to be something in there that is going to open up your eyes to something that you may not have been thinking about. And just that little light bulb effect, when I was teaching, and I still do a lot of teaching, I look out along, among the audience, and it's just, you always just see that little light bulb popping. And that's really what Acres does for people, is it gives you that little pop of, oh, I didn't know that, or that's fascinating. I mean, I remember, I can't even remember the author, but the one on the sea minerals and on kelp meal. And, and you mentioned the, compost books. I mean, these are all books that have been integral into what we've done here. and they all came out of Acres. And, it's just a guy that's done it his whole life and put his whole sweat and blood into this. It doesn't have to be, this dissertation on a academic level. It's just, this guy did this for 30 years with great success. There's got to be something to it.
Well, and I'd encourage your listeners to, you think about it, how much benefit do you need to get to pay for a $20, $30 subscription, or you get one idea, you get one thing. So even though, don't be afraid that it says agriculture, there's so much soil health info, and I hope people do check out Acres USA, and it's living on just vibrantly. So
what's next for you? I mean, what are you doing these days? Are you doing anything? Are you writing? Are you doing anything?
I've published a few specialized books on herbal out of Europe, on herbal medicine and distilled spirits and vinegars. Also, I'm making a lot of sawdust. I'm a wood turner and woodworker.
I've heard that.
And I've got a new granddaughter, and just trying to.
So you're living life.
The next chapter of life. So I gave Acres many decades, and the time it's someone else's turn. You run out of fresh ideas. Some fresh blood just sometimes can reinvigorate something, and I'm thrilled with the team that's running things now.
Will you still show up at the conferences, or are you gonna? You're gonna still be there. Okay.
Too many friends to not.
So I'll probably see you in Cincinnati in December.
I hope
Actually,
so.
in Covington. By the way, I was born in Covington, Kentucky, where you're kind of having that conference. So it's a little known fact of me, but I'm a Kentucky boy by birth. Didn't live there long, unfortunately, but I was born in a town that doesn't exist anymore, South Fort Mitchell, which is right outside of Covington. I was born in a Covington hospital. But Fred, I got to thank you so much for so many things. And it was really a pleasure to catch up with you again. And hopefully we do have a chance, if we get together in Cincinnati, let's break some bread and catch up. And again, thank you for joining us here. I mean, it's been a huge influence to me personally. I think a lot of the people that have worked for me, with me, it's all kind of trickled down from what you and your family started. So we are all extremely grateful. And I really encourage you to keep doing something right, influence people. What you guys have done is magical. And I'm just thankful.
Thank you. You've made this. I avoid these sort of things like the plague. You've made it pretty famous. So,
well, thanks. I appreciate you doing that. And that, my friends, is the EarthWorks podcast. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. You get notification on some fascinating conversations like our friend here, Mr. Fred Walters, the former publisher of Acres USA. And we will be back again next week with another interesting and entertaining conversation with somebody. Thanks again, Fred.